I came home that evening expecting the familiar rhythm of our shared life, the quiet predictability that had always made our place feel like a refuge. I imagined the soft clatter of dishes, the low hum of something cooking, the usual casual question about my day, the kind of ordinary moments that stitch a marriage together without anyone noticing. Instead, the atmosphere felt stiff, almost ceremonial. My wife, who I'll call Maris now, was sitting rigidly at the kitchen table, hands folded, posture straight, eyes focused forward like someone preparing to deliver a formal announcement. The silence alone felt wrong. Before I could even take off my jacket or set my keys down, she spoke in a measured, unnatural tone that didn't sound like her at all. She said we needed to have a serious conversation about our relationship. Not about our day, not about dinner, not about anything small, about us. The word hung in the air like a warning sign. I opened the fridge, grabbed a drink, and sat across from her, already feeling a knot forming in my stomach. She looked like she had rehearsed every word in advance, like this was a presentation she had practiced in her head. She started talking about structure, organization, and maturity, words that sounded more like business language than the language of a marriage. She said she had been thinking deeply about how to improve our relationship and believed we needed clearer systems, clearer boundaries, clearer rules. None of it sounded like love. None of it sounded like partnership. It sounded like management. When she finally said that intimacy should be planned and limited, that it should happen on a fixed schedule, I genuinely thought she was joking. But her face was serious, calm, almost clinical. She spoke about intentional connection and long-term sustainability like she was quoting a seminar. I felt something shift inside me, a quiet disbelief turning into something colder. This wasn't a conversation between two people in love. It felt like a policy update, a restructuring, a reorganization of something that had never been broken in the first place. And in that moment, sitting at that table, I realized I wasn't part of a conversation. I was being informed of a decision. I asked her what she actually meant, hoping I had misunderstood, but the more she explained, the worse it sounded. She talked about how availability reduces appreciation, how too much closeness makes people complacent, how boundaries create value. The words didn't feel like they came from her heart. They felt borrowed, imported, copied from somewhere else. I made a joke about it sounding like a subscription plan instead of a marriage, but she didn't laugh. She doubled down, insisting this was about maturity, responsibility, and emotional discipline. That's when I understood that this wasn't an idea we were exploring together. This was a policy she had already written and was now rolling out. I asked her directly if she was saying she wanted to limit affection in our home, and she reframed it as quality over quantity, as if love was a resource that needed rationing. That word stuck in my mind, rationing. It didn't sound like romance. It sounded like scarcity. It sounded like control. I told her that if our marriage was being converted into a managed system with restrictions and rules, then I needed to evaluate whether I was still comfortable with the arrangement. That shook her. Her confidence cracked for a second, but she tried to hold her position, insisting I was being dramatic. But from my perspective, she had just turned something organic into something transactional, so I leaned into her logic. I told her that if our relationship was now structured like a service agreement, then I would start treating it like one, professionally, cautiously, without emotional investment beyond what the terms allowed. I could see confusion in her eyes. She hadn't expected resistance framed that way. I stood up, not angry, but detached, and told her I needed time to think about whether I wanted to stay committed to something that now came with limitations I never agreed to. When I walked away, I could hear her behind me, unsettled, suddenly unsure of the authority she thought she had in that moment. That night set a tone that carried into the days that followed. The house didn't explode into chaos, it went quiet instead. Subtle, controlled, polite. The kind of distance that's more painful than yelling because it feels permanent. When she spoke to me, I answered kindly but briefly. When she tried to share stories about work or family, I listened but didn't engage the way I used to. I wasn't cold, but I wasn't warm either. I was neutral, professional. Exactly what a structured relationship felt like in practice. She noticed, of course. One evening she asked why I felt distant, and I told her I wasn't upset. I was adjusting. Adjusting to the new model she introduced. Adjusting to the idea that spontaneity and closeness were no longer part of the system. When she tried to walk it back, saying she only meant one part of our relationship, I told her you can't isolate intimacy from emotion without affecting everything else. When you restrict one form of closeness, the others don't survive untouched. She didn't have a response for that. A few nights later, she tried to create a romantic atmosphere, candles, my favorite food, soft music, the whole performance. But it felt forced, staged, like an apology disguised as seduction. I pointed out the contradiction. You can't impose rules and then act surprised when the warmth disappears. Romance doesn't survive regulation. She finally admitted that the idea hadn't come from nowhere, that conversations at work had influenced her, that other women had told her men get complacent, that affection should be controlled, that scarcity creates value. And suddenly everything made sense. This wasn't her belief system, it was imported ideology. The more she talked, the clearer it became that she had absorbed the fears and frustrations of people who weren't living our life. People who weren't in our house, people who didn't know our marriage. She admitted that these women constantly complained about their own relationships, about their husbands, about feeling unappreciated, about emotional distance. They spoke about marriage like a battlefield instead of a partnership, and instead of questioning their bitterness, she internalized it. She let their dissatisfaction rewrite her perception of us. I told her plainly that people who are happy in their marriages don't sit around strategizing control tactics. They don't treat affection like leverage. They don't talk about their partners like problems to be managed. And that's when I saw it hit her. She had taken advice from people who were miserable and applied it to a relationship that wasn't broken. She cried, but it wasn't the kind of crying that manipulates. It was the kind that comes from realizing you made a mistake you can't undo easily. I told her that letting outsiders influence decisions in our marriage wasn't just hurtful, it was dangerous. It meant she valued their opinions over our reality, over our history, over our actual connection. I made it clear that I wouldn't compete with a group of people who weren't invested in our happiness, that our marriage couldn't survive if it was run by a committee of outsiders. And for the first time since the conversation began, she didn't argue. A few days later, she told me she had cut off those conversations at work, that she had told them she wouldn't discuss her marriage anymore, that she had drawn a line. They didn't respond well. They accused me of manipulating her, isolating her, controlling her. But instead of believing them, she finally questioned them. She realized they were invested in conflict, not healing, in drama, not peace, in control, not connection. She told me they framed unhappiness as normal and peace as naive. They treated dysfunction like maturity. They treated stability like weakness. And she finally saw how twisted that logic was. She admitted she never actually wanted to limit anything between us, that she liked our closeness, that she liked the way things were, that she only agreed to change because she was made to feel foolish for being content, ashamed for being happy, ashamed for loving freely without rules or games. She cried again, but this time it felt like release, not fear. I told her that misery recruits and bitterness evangelizes, that unhappy people rarely want others to succeed where they failed. They don't want examples of healthy love around them because it exposes their own pain. She listened, really listened. We didn't reset overnight. It wasn't magical. It wasn't a movie ending, but something real shifted. The house started feeling warm again instead of tense. Conversations felt natural again instead of careful. Laughter came back slowly, cautiously, but genuinely. She stopped outsourcing her thinking. She stopped seeking validation from people who thrived on dissatisfaction. She chose our reality over their narratives. Weeks later, she told me those women had mostly stopped talking to her, that she had become boring to them, not dramatic enough, not angry enough, not broken enough. And she said it like it was a compliment. She told me she finally understood that they didn't want solutions, they wanted solidarity in misery. They didn't want healing, they wanted company in dysfunction. And she didn't want that life. She wanted ours. She wanted the quiet, simple, steady version of love that doesn't trend on social media but lasts in real life. By the time the dust settled, we weren't the same as before, but we were stronger, more aware, more protected. We understood something fundamental. Love doesn't survive when it's treated like a resource to be controlled. Marriage doesn't thrive when it's treated like a system to be optimized. Intimacy doesn't grow under management, it grows under trust. We learned that boundaries are meant to protect people, not control them. And that influence is powerful enough to poison even good relationships if you don't guard against it. She told me she would never again let outsiders define our marriage. I told her I would never stay in a relationship where love had to be earned through compliance. We chose each other deliberately, not out of habit, not out of fear, not out of pressure, but out of clarity. And that choice felt stronger than anything we had before. That was the real turning point. Not the argument, not the tension, not the conflict, but the realization that we were either going to protect what we had or let other people reshape it. We chose protection. We chose privacy. We chose partnership. We chose love without quotas, without rules, without committees, without external governance. Just two people deciding that what they built together mattered more than any voice outside their home. And in the end, that choice didn't just save the relationship. It rebuilt it on something stronger than routine, conscious commitment. The weeks that followed felt like a slow, careful rebuilding, not dramatic, not cinematic, but real in the quiet ways that actually matter. The kind of healing that doesn't announce itself but shows up in small details. The way she looked at me when I walked into a room, the way conversations lasted longer again, the way silence felt comfortable instead of tense. Our home no longer felt like a negotiation space or a battlefield of unspoken rules. It felt like a shared place again. She stopped checking her phone obsessively after work, stopped carrying the emotional residue of other people's frustrations into our living room. I could see the difference in her body language, in her tone, in the way she laughed without forcing it. It wasn't performative anymore. It wasn't an attempt to fix something. It was just natural closeness returning on its own. One evening, while we were sitting on the couch in silence, not even watching anything, she rested her head on my shoulder without thinking about it, without hesitation, without checking herself. That small, unconscious gesture told me more than any apology ever could. It meant she wasn't regulating herself anymore. She wasn't measuring affection. She wasn't managing intimacy. She was just being my wife again. And I realized that the most damaging part of what happened wasn't the idea itself. It was the mindset behind it. The idea that love should be controlled. The idea that connection should be engineered. The idea that desire should be manufactured through strategy instead of trust. Once that mindset was gone, everything else naturally started healing. We talked more openly than we ever had before, not in heavy, dramatic conversations, but in honest, grounded ones. She admitted that she had started seeing relationships through a lens of competition instead of cooperation, power instead of partnership, influence instead of intimacy. She told me how those voices at work made her feel small for being content, naive for being happy, foolish for being satisfied. They framed peace as weakness and stability as boredom. They talked about marriage like a game that needed strategy instead of a bond that needed care. She said she didn't even realize how deeply it had affected her thinking until she stepped away from it. Distance gave her clarity. She could suddenly hear how toxic it all sounded, how transactional, how joyless. I told her that the most dangerous ideas are the ones that disguise themselves as maturity and growth while quietly eroding trust, control disguised as wisdom, manipulation disguised as empowerment, fear disguised as boundaries. She listened, not defensively, not emotionally, but thoughtfully. For the first time in a long time, it felt like we were learning together instead of arguing against each other. There was a moment one night when she said something that stayed with me. She said, "I think I forgot that love is supposed to feel safe. Not exciting, not dramatic, not intense, safe, calm, warm, stable." She said the constant noise from other people had made her believe that chaos was normal and peace was fake. That if things weren't difficult, they weren't real. That if there wasn't conflict, something must be wrong. She said she had started distrusting happiness itself. That hit hard because it explained everything. She wasn't trying to control me, she was trying to recreate a version of marriage she had been told was real. A version filled with tension, struggle, power plays, and emotional scarcity. And our relationship didn't fit that model. It was quiet, stable, affectionate, predictable in the best way. Instead of valuing that, she questioned it. Instead of protecting it, she tried to restructure it. And now she saw how backwards that was. Love isn't proven through suffering. Commitment isn't proven through control. Desire isn't created through deprivation. Trust isn't built through management. As time passed, I noticed something else change too, my own mindset. I stopped being defensive. I stopped waiting for the next mistake. I stopped bracing myself for another policy update, another restructuring conversation, another "we need to talk." I relaxed again. I trusted again, not blindly but consciously. Trust isn't automatic after something like that, it's a choice, a decision, a risk. But I chose it because I saw real change, not surface change, not performance, not damage control. Actual behavioral change, different boundaries, different priorities, different influences. She didn't just say she understood, she acted like it. She protected our privacy. She defended our relationship when others tried to criticize it. She stopped letting outside voices define inside decisions. And that mattered more than any apology ever could. Love isn't proven through words. It's proven through patterns. One evening, months later, we were cooking together, laughing about something stupid, music playing in the background, the kind of ordinary moment that used to define our life. She suddenly stopped and looked at me and said, "I almost ruined this." Not dramatically, not emotionally, just honestly. I nodded because it was true. But I also told her that we almost lost it, not because of one bad idea, but because of unchallenged influence. Because we didn't protect our relationship from people who had no stake in its success. Because we underestimated how powerful other people's narratives can be when you hear them often enough. Repetition becomes belief. Noise becomes truth. And if you don't filter it, it replaces your own reality. We both understood that now. That marriage isn't just about loving each other, it's about guarding what you build together, from envy, from resentment, from outside agendas, from bitterness disguised as advice. We also learned something else, that not every voice deserves access to your relationship. Not every opinion deserves space. Not every perspective deserves influence. Some people don't want to help, they want to validate their own pain. They don't want solutions, they want company in suffering. And they don't want your happiness if it reminds them of what they don't have. We stopped romanticizing support systems that are built on shared negativity instead of shared growth. Real support doesn't sabotage stability. Real support doesn't create problems to feel useful. Real support doesn't weaponize fear. Real support strengthens what's already good. It doesn't dismantle it. Over time, our intimacy didn't just return, it deepened. Not because of effort, not because of planning, not because of structure, but because of trust. Because there were no rules, no quotas, no policies, no frameworks, just connection, natural, unforced, unmanaged. We stopped thinking about it and started living it, and that made everything else lighter. Conversations felt easier. Conflict felt safer. Disagreements didn't feel threatening. There was no underlying power struggle anymore. No invisible competition. No emotional leverage. Just two people on the same side again. Partners, not opponents. Teammates, not managers. Sometimes we talked about it openly, not with anger but with perspective. We treated it like a lesson instead of a wound. A reminder of how easily good things can be disrupted if you stop protecting them. A reminder that love doesn't need optimization. It needs presence, attention, respect, privacy, care. It needs two people choosing each other more than they choose outside validation. It needs loyalty not just in actions but in influence. Who you listen to, who you trust, who you let shape your thinking. She once said, "I didn't realize loyalty included protecting your partner from other people's opinions." And that sentence alone showed how much she had grown. We never went back to normal because normal implies unconscious habit. We went to something better, intentional connection, not structured, not regulated, not scheduled. Intentional in choice, not in control. We chose each other daily not because we had to, but because we wanted to, not because of fear, but because of value, not because of rules, but because of trust. And that difference changed everything. Love felt lighter, safer, freer, stronger. Looking back, I don't even see the situation as a crisis anymore. I see it as a test of influence, a test of priorities, a test of loyalty not in fidelity but in belief. Who do you believe about your marriage, outsiders or your partner, narratives or reality, noise or experience? She chose me. I chose her. And that choice mattered more than the mistake that came before it, because mistakes happen, influence happens, confusion happens. But what defines a relationship isn't the disruption, it's the response to it. Now when I think about it, I don't feel anger, I feel clarity, I feel grounded, I feel certain. We learned that our relationship doesn't need external validation. It doesn't need approval. It doesn't need comparison. It doesn't need competition. It doesn't need scarcity. It doesn't need control. It just needs two people who protect it from everything that tries to reshape it into something it was never meant to be. And that protection is an act of love as real as any kiss, any touch, any word, any promise. We didn't save our marriage by fixing problems. We saved it by refusing to create them, by refusing to let bitterness define it, by refusing to let other people's unhappiness rewrite our happiness, by choosing partnership over performance, trust over tactics, connection over control, love over influence. And that choice continues every day, not as a dramatic vow, not as a grand declaration, but as a quiet, consistent decision to put each other first in a world full of voices that would rather tear things apart than watch them thrive. And that, more than anything else, is what we kept.